The Living Murray is quite a broad program managed by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Within South Australia, it's managed by the Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources, and we work in conjunction with the Narrandjeri Regional Authority, the CLIM program, other community organisations, so it really is a collaborative project. The Living Murray is all about returning environmental water to the environment. During the drought, we had not very much water come down the river into the lower lake system. Because of that, we had a drop in water levels by almost 2 metres, and that resulted in complete disconnection of the fringing wetland habitat around the edges of the lake from the actual water body.
We say how the Coorong used to be black with ducks, and we can go anywhere along the Coorong and get a feed of fish. And when I go there today now, that fresh water's gone, the frogs are gone, and there's salt there. That's what we're talking about at the moment. Our lakes, our Coorong, our river is dying.
This is one of the major rivers in Australia and one of the major rivers in our southern hemisphere.
Where I live in Adelaide, I mean, it's my water supply partially. Without the River Murray, there wouldn't be the town of Adelaide.
If we don't look after the river and have adequate environmental flows, species can decline, as we've seen during the drought, and sometimes become extinct.
Water is life. If we don't have water, we're all sure to perish from that.
If you have a drain and it's meant to flow and it doesn't flow, then where it stops, it gets a dirty, smelly mess. And a river is the same. The river needs to flow. A river that doesn't flow is a river that's going to die.
The reason that this project is so important is because this is one of the last, really great remaining wetland systems in Australia and within the Murray-Darling Basin. It's the only estuary system. Every year we get hundreds of thousands of birds travelling from Siberia to come to our site and to feed. Ecologically, this area is really significant.
About 50% of the southeast region prior to colonisation was classified as a wetland, so it was covered in water for significant parts of the year. And when it was colonised, there was an active program of drainage. The majority of that water was drained out to the oceans. The major water that traditionally flowed into the South Lagoon came from the southern part of the state. The fresh water used to flow because it's a very slight downhill gradient from the Victorian border all the way to the Coorong.
And that's what kept the southern lagoon of the Coorong alive. And the River Murray water coming down kept the northern lagoon of the Coorong alive. The river flowing keeps Ngurrindjeri country alive. And we managed it and looked after it and cared for it. That's why it sustained us for thousands of years. But in my lifetime now, I've seen that slowly deteriorating. Our cultural knowledge tells us what the area looked like before European farming practices and capturing of water was built into the river system, such as locks and weirs and barrages. The lands and waters is a living body. You have to be very careful what you do with it. I believe Western science and Indigenous knowledge and culture got to go hand in hand and undo a lot of that damage that's been created.
We're here at Hunters Creek doing some monitoring of the Hunters Creek fishway, and what we're looking at is fish that actually move through the fishway. So the fishway is a series of pools that step up to the lake, and in between each pool there's a little, what we call a vertical slot, a gap, and the water flows through there, but it doesn't flow too fast. So the fish come in through the entrance down there, they move into the first pool, have a little rest, swim into the next pool, and so on as they go upstream. And I suppose the reason that we need a fishway here and we need to be looking at fish moving through here was that 80 or so years ago, before the barrages and before this structure was built here, this place used to be an area where the fresh water would come down through the lower lakes and mix with the salt water and form an estuary. And then in the 1940s we had the barrages built and some of these structures, and it stopped those fish moving, and it also separated the ocean and the estuary from the fresh water.
At Pelican Point area, the salt water and the fresh water used to mix there. And it was known to Ngarrindjeri as the creation place, the place of creation, of birthing, as the meeting of the waters. When the barrages were built, a straight line across there that separated that fresh water to that salt water and took away that life-giving source of that area.
For quite a while there during drought, the barrages weren't open at all. So for species such as Congolli, we were catching them in such low numbers, and they would have been common as mustard once upon a time. We nearly lost them from the system. They only lived for about 5 or 6 years, and we had the barrages closed for about 5 years. So there was a tipping point where we nearly lost them.
So this is one of my favourite species. This is a Congolli. They can grow to at least twice the size of this one. And these have a cultural significance too because they were a food source for the Ngarrindjeri. But their numbers have declined because they need connectivity between the Coorong estuary and the lower lakes. They suffered severely during the drought. That was an indicator of how important it is to maintain adequate environmental flows so that the same mistake doesn't occur in the future.
Environmental flows or environmental water is an allocation of water that is specifically for the environment. So it works the same as an irrigation allocation or something for human consumption. If we don't fix the river, then our wetlands are really going to start declining, even more so than they are already.
Wetlands of the River Murray are very important for the river system as a whole. People refer to them as the livers or the kidneys of the system. They trap sediment, often also trapping things like excess nutrients, heavy metals. They're good at capturing these things, locking them up in the sediment. When we had a more variable water regime, you'd have some of those sediments exposed every now and then. Then you'd have a flooding, so it's that whole boom and bust. Then you'd have a flooding and you'd take all of those excess materials out to sea.
In 2008, we started the living Murray fish condition monitoring in the Coorong. And we clearly document that the decline of fish population and clearly a range of species that are dependent on freshwater inflows.
We go to a number of sites around the lower lakes and we set nets overnight so that we can catch fish that are active during night time. Specifically, we're looking for some of the threatened fish species, southern pygmy perch, Yarra pygmy perch and Murray hardyhead. They're small-bodied fish species. They only grow to about 7 or 8 centimetres at the most. And if we do detect those, we'll measure those to give us an idea of the size structure of the population so that we know whether they've been reproducing and recruiting over that season. We have an unspecked hardyhead that is 41 millimetres long.
Since 2010, when this large flow came down and with enormous barrage release into the Coorong, we start to see some small body fish such as smallmouth hardyhead and sandy spread and gobies, that they start to recover gradually. So flow is the pivotal thing.
So let's just see what we've got in the sample that we took out there. So that is a little crustacean, and they have been incredibly common in the system now after the flood. So there was thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So they showed a very, very strong response. Any drop in numbers of these macroinvertebrates, there's not enough for the birds and the fish, and their numbers respectively decline. They are living fairly shallow underneath the surface, so the birds with that short bill can pick them out of the sediment as you're seeing there. This is a kind of snail that is fairly common in all around Australia, but I haven't actually seen it in the Coorong for quite some time. These are grazers, so you only find them when there's enough food for them on the sediment surface, so there would be some microalgae and other material that they can graze on, so birds like the oyster catcher might be picking up some of them perhaps. And it's very good to see that some of them are now coming back. In the drought, a lot of these worms were totally confined to live in the Murray mouth, and now after the flow we are seeing that a lot of them are now coming back to sites like here in the North Lagoon, so the abundances at the moment are much higher here than near the Murray mouth. So for them to actually be able to come back and recolonize some of these sediments, we really need all of that water and the environmental flow to come here. It's just so important that we keep the hydrodynamics and the water flow in a good condition.
Here we go. Jackpot. So we've been doing repeat surveys, so we've got really good information on how the plant community has changed. If you come out here in 2008, 2009 during the drought, for probably about half a kilometre, you just would have seen sand. It's amazing how quickly that this has bounced back. So they're fairly sensitive to poor water quality. Aquatic plants they're very important components of an ecosystem. They turn sunlight and carbon dioxide into sugar, protein. They provide habitat for birds, fish. They're a sink for nutrients. They're very efficient at taking nutrients out of the water column and out of the soil and incorporating them into plant material. If you don't have plants, there's a lot of things that depend on them. Unfortunately here we're sort of a bit limited to what we can do with regards to management because we are very much reliant on what comes down the river. We don't have a tap we can turn on at the border or at Wellington to fill up the lower lakes.
We travel all the way over here to Strathalbyn to collect these rushes. They're a three-pronged type rusher. You'll be able to identify them by the top. They're a Cyprus Gymnocaulus vaginatus. The old fella's called the mungadoo.
The rushes that are needed for the cultural tradition of weaving are freshwater rushes. And they grow where there's good quality fresh water under the ground. Now where they used to grow along the Coorong and areas around the lake, they're no longer there. When we go there, they're gone, they're died. What we start seeing salt.
Just through the growth of rushes, we know that we've got a crisis. 15 years ago, along the Coorong, we were able to pick 6 foot, 8 foot tall rushes, and there's nothing there. So at the moment, we travel all the way over here to Strathalbyn to collect these rushes. We're sort of collecting this lot and letting that lot grow back home. And by picking these rushes, we're helping them to grow. Like, what happens is with a lot of these, we flick back into the ground and also give them a shake so you've got the seeds back into the soil here. So it's very important to be able to keep that going.
Stitch by stitch, circle by circle, weaving is like the creation of life, and it brings people together.
Everything's connected. The lands, the waters, the plants, the animals, our relationship with our country, our responsibilities for caring for our Ngāchis. All of these things have to be managed collectively.
If our Ngāchis, that's the birds and the animals, which connects us to our lands and our waters, if they die, our lands and our waters die, in our stories, we die. And that's where those stories are created and made to tell us how to manage country and care for country and don't be greedy and don't take any more than what you need.
So it was a balanced system, a complete balanced system. And we have those obligations to look after those particular species that look after country. It is our essential being of who we are as Ngarrindjeri.
It's very important that the people who are most concerned or connected or who rely on it most heavily are also involved in that management. On the Community Advisory Panel, we have a good range of people, and this is important because they bring a very broad cross-section of ideas, And they take those ideas back to their community as well, so it's a good two-way flow of information. If you have the connectedness between the people and the government and the environment that they're working with, it's all going to work out much better. If you haven't got the connectedness, then things go wrong.
Western science has done a lot of damage, and it's cultural knowledge that's been trying to undo that damage. You're talking about environmental water. We want you to look at it from our eyes, from our view too, and look at cultural water. We're a water people, and our culture, our heritage, our beliefs, our stories all revolve around water.
All of our ancestors' knowledge and the stories about the South Lagoon, you know, it was actually one of the most highly productive parts of our country. That's where, you know, a lot of our people, you know, traditionally got their food, their water. In the last 20 or 30 years, the salinity levels gone, you know, off the scales, particularly during the drought seasons. It's really declined significantly. All your aquatic plants, a lot of the microinvertebrates disappeared. You had high spikes in brine shrimp, which is an indicator of not a healthy system because they live in hypersaline environments.
In the South Lagoon, it's almost fishless. It's only occasionally we caught a few individual smallmouth hardyhead, which is the most salt-tolerant species, and salinity is way above 100 parts per thousand.
We'd like to be able to provide enough water so that the salinities and the water levels in the South Lagoon are able to support the native plants and animals that have always lived there.
One thing Western science cannot control, and that's nature. Those things we've got to live with. If it's not drought we're living with, well then it's flooding rains. You've got to be prepared for that too. You've got to work with nature and live with nature. Be a part of it and not try and control it.
It's the thing of person and place that you can't separate, and unfortunately in Western society they do separate.
The management we do in wetlands is trying to reinstate more variable water regimes, and sometimes that does involve manipulating those wetlands in isolation to the river. So we're looking at a river that's been quite regulated. The water levels are, you know, they don't change a lot, they don't change as much as they would have. Our flora and fauna actually, they rely on fluctuating water levels. Even a small increase in river levels tips the water out into new areas. So we're trying to reinstate that. It's a fairly big intervention. You're putting in a solid structure, something that's going to disconnect the wetland from the river. It's not something we do lightly, and not all wetlands are suited to it. You are relying on closing it at certain times of the year, allowing evaporation to draw the levels down, and then opening it at certain times of the year. And that timing is very, very crucial. So a lot of the work we do is getting all of those timings right. And then we do a lot of condition monitoring around that, monitoring fish, frogs, birds, and the whole point of that is to show whether or not what you're doing in that wetland is actually working.
Ready? pH is 8.2. Dissolved oxygen is 6.98. And turbidity is 63.8.
It's a flow-on effect to all of those systems. So you've got fish that have to move between freshwater systems and saltwater systems to be able to complete their life cycle. If you don't have enough flow connecting those two, they're not going to be able to do it. You've got frog species that rely on newly inundated, vegetated areas to complete their life cycle. So if you start lining up all the different species and all of their minimum requirements, it's a pretty fine balancing act.
As Ngurrindjeri, we've been managing our lands and waters for thousands of years. We've managed it quite well. And it's only in recent times you've had a more Western model where we've really come to a crisis situation, which was highlighted by the drought. But even without the drought, we were still heading in the direction of having a system which wasn't going to survive into the future. From Ngurrindjeri perspective, We don't want to be saying, oh, the minimum is enough. That's only just going to keep it alive, keep it healthy to a degree. We look at cultural indicators, to be able to drink the water from fresh water holes, or to be able to catch, abundant fish from an area, or to be able to gather enough rushes from our country to carry out our cultural practices. And these are sort of things you can't quantify, you can't label, you can't put a number against.
We look at numbers, we look at data. We don't have that sort of real connection that I've felt that the Narrandjeri have. They've sort of been able to say, 50 years ago, we used to fish here, get swan eggs from here, things that I know nothing about. I'm very, very tunnel vision. I look at aquatic plants. The insight that's been passed down through the generations is something that I think a lot of scientists can really learn from, because they come at it from the opposite direction, where they look at everything as a whole.
Our science is how we read our lands and our waters, how we take notice to our birds, our animals. We take notice to our plants that are growing and then they die, telling us there's a problem in our waterways. That's our science. When we look at what the pelicans are doing, we see the changes in these weather patterns. That's science.
So we're trying to flip that coin over and saying, well, we do have the knowledge. We do have the scientific experts, because we are the experts. We have been here that long. We know the stories and the connectivity of country.
All this rock here is all burnt fire rock from the fireplaces of our old ancestors.
I'd like to see non-Aboriginal people start to learn and actually see our country through the eyes of Narrandjeri. They take on our knowledge and our skills and weigh it equally with their Western mythologies.
The important thing that's been underlined for me from Narrandjeri Wisdom is healthy environment, healthy people. You have that connection, it works. We've seen in recent years with the drought, unhealthy environment, unhealthy people. Not just Narrandjeri, but across the whole population. I think it's a very important connection.
What does the future hold? What do people think is going to happen? We're taking it for granted that it's going to be there. But one day we might have a rude awakening, and that's when reality's going to hit home hard, and people are going to be shocked.
Past civilizations have failed when their rivers stop flowing, and it is really important that we look after our river and that it flows.
The entire system is huge, and it's all connected. Fish don't stop at the border, birds don't stop from flying over the border. What your neighbours do upstream affects your neighbours downstream. It is all one system, and it should not be managed in isolation.
So what our program's trying to do is to secure more environmental water for the area so that we never have to go through what we went through during the drought again.
The benchmark of a healthy system would be when you can go down to that river and put a glass in and pick it up and drink it. When you can go into Lake Alexandrian or Albert and drink that water straight from its source and let the river flow free again and put it back the way it used to be. Well, that would be the perfect picture. And we know everything would come back to life again. But what we've got to do is find that management plan of finding a balance of Indigenous science and knowledge combined with Western science and caring for country and caring for our lands and waters, caring for our birds, our animals, for our plants, and caring for each other. Now, if we could find that balance, then we've got a management plan that will lead us through the next generations.